Okay, so in this video, we are going to go over genetic characteristics and traits. First, we need to take care of some vocabulary. So, if you see the term dominant, what does that make you think of? To me, it makes me think of somebody who maybe monopolizes the conversation. They're the person that overpowers everyone else. Dominant trait is that way. A recessive trait is maybe the person who sits in the back of the classroom and just kind of observes and they're there, but they're not really making their presence known. That's recessive. So when we are playing around in this entire section, we're going to be drawing a ton of Punnett squares. So you need to know how to draw out these traits. Hopefully some of us have had biology in high school and you've already done Punnett squares and you're like, yeah, I got this. But for anyone who has not done this, let's start at the basics. How we draw a dominant trait is going to be written as a capital letter, and how we draw a recessive trait would be written as a lowercase letter, because dominants are going to be the stronger ones. When we talk about a dominant trait, you only need one of those genes for that dominant trait to show up. You can have one or both genes be a dominant gene, but you only need one gene for that dominant gene to show up. If you've got a recessive trait, like the white pea flower in our previous video, that recessive trait, you have to have both genes. You have to have mom's genes and dad's gene to have that recessive trait actually be expressed, because otherwise it gets masked by the dominant trait next to it. So we've got two terms here. We've got homozygous and heterozygous. Homo, again, we've talked about it before, means same. Homo means the same. So if I wrote something that was homozygous, they're the same. So we have homozygous, let's write it down, homozygous, and we could have homozygous dominant. So homozygous means the same, and if they're dominant, they're capital letters. So homozygous dominant is written like this. What if we had homozygous recessive? Homozygous recessive, I would write that like this. So they're both, again, they're the same, and they're the same, and they are recessive, so they are both lowercase letters. What if I wasn't homozygous? If I wasn't homo, I am hetero, and heterozygous is different. So heteros are going to be written as one dominant letter and one recessive letter when we write these down. So that is what heterozygous looks like. So when you have questions on the test and you have situations that you will be told, mom is homozygous for this trait and this trait is dominant, then you know that I would write it like this. Or if dad is a carrier, dad's a carrier for this trait, then that means that they're heterozygous. They have one gene that's one thing and one gene that's another thing. They're a carrier. They could be homozygous. They could be displaying a trait that is a recessive trait. If they are displaying a trait that is a recessive trait, they're homozygous recessive. So I'll need y'all to know, given the clues in the word problem on the test, how do I write this out? What do I need to write this out? There are two more terms on this slide here. We've got genotype and phenotype. Genotype are the genes. They are what they are. So a genotype, if we were going to say that we have all three of these types, we have this one, we have this one, heterozygous, and we're going to have homozygous recessive. And we're going to say that big A equals, I'm going with brown hair, and little a equals recessive hair color, like red. So when we have this and this and this, these are all three different genotypes. So if we're looking at genotypes, this is one, and this is one, and this is one. I would write the genotype as a 1 to a 1 to a 1 ratio, because literally they're all different genes. These are three different distinct genotypes. They're different. Phenotype is what gets expressed what actually shows up. So if I look at the phenotypes of this guy, so I've got a homozygous dominant, that person, if we say that uppercase letter A is going to be for brown hair, a person with these genes with two capital letter A's, they're going to have brown hair. So phenotypes, we're going to have brown here. And what about this person? This one has one dominant gene and one recessive gene. On a dominant trait, we only have to have one to express. So only one of these has to be here to show up as, in this case, brown hair. So if we've got one dominant A, this person's got brown hair. And then this person, we have two lowercase a's. So lowercase is recessive. You're only going to see this recessive trait if both mom and dad's genes have the recessive, if they pass the recessive on. So this person with a lowercase a and a lowercase a would have the recessive hair color. And we said that recessive hair color is red. So your phenotype, what gets expressed? There are two phenotypes. You're either brown or you're red. So when I write this ratio, I would say phenotypes are 2 to 1, brown versus red, where genotypes were absolutely three different sets of genes. So just to summarize, genotypes are the genes. They are what they are. Phenotypes are what actually get expressed from those genes. So a homozygous dominant and a heterozygous is still going to express that dominant trait. They're still going to have the same phenotype, whatever that phenotype may be, that dominant trait gets expressed. So these two are both the same phenotype. This is a different phenotype. This is the recessive trait, and it does not look like the dominant trait, whatever that example could be. So our phenotype, what actually shows up, what you can see, what gets expressed. The genotype is what it is. They are literally the genes. So let's move on. When we talk about dominant and recessive traits, there are some regarding people that they mention in the textbook. So achondroplasia, Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones. If you watch Game of Thrones, I know it's old now, but if you watched that person who drinks and he knows things, he has achondroplasia, which is a type of dwarfism. That's what that is, and that is a dominant trait. Brachydactyly, if you have short bones in your fingers, these are all genetic traits. If you are dominant, remember, how many genes do you have to have for a dominant trait to show up? One. You only need one. So you only need one gene for these things to show up. Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a lethal disease. You have this gene, and if you have this gene, you are unfortunately going to pass away early if you have Huntington's disease. It's a terrible disease. It's a neurodegenerative disorder. And the horrible thing about this thing is you don't even know that you have it until the symptoms show up, and those don't show up until later in life. You could be 20, 30 years old before these symptoms show up, and maybe you've already had kids and you've passed this gene on to them. Again, you only need one of these genes to show up for Huntington's. Once it shows up, you've got about 15, 20 years tops of life expectancy once this gene starts to express itself with Huntington's disease. So it is a dominant lethal. Usually when we talk about lethal disorders, they're recessive, and you have to have it from both parents to have this disease. But this is an exception, and this is a dominant lethal disorder. So that's Huntington's. Marfan syndrome is a disorder of the connective tissue, and it's when it causes issues with the heart. It also is typical in people that have longer limbs, maybe long arms, and kind of on the thinner side. There was some speculation that maybe Michael Phelps had Marfan syndrome because he has such long arms. He's got that huge wingspan that helps him in the water. Marfan syndrome is a genetic disorder for connective tissue. Neurofibromatosis is a disorder that causes tumors. It causes tumors underneath the skin. It causes tumors on the bones. And you only need one of these genes, again, to express this dominant, miserable, painful disorder is neurofibromatosis. Widow's Peak is it's kind of hard to see, but instead of going just straight across, if your hair comes down and that kind of Count Dracula kind of look there, that's Widow's Peak. If it goes straight across, you don't have Widow's Peak. I've got Widow's Peak going on right there. Woolly hair is curly hair, but it's not like all over your head. It's not your entire scalp has this tightly coiled hair. It's in a patch. You can Google it and see different images, but it's just in one location, and the rest of the hair doesn't look like that. It's just that one patch of hair is woolly hair. So this is another type of dominant trait. Recessive traits. Again, you have to have both barrels, mom and dad's genes have to hit you for this recessive trait to show up. Albinism, when you are lacking pigmentation in your skin and your hair, you're lacking pigmentation, that's albinism. CF, cystic fibrosis, is when you have a genetic condition that affects the proteins on the cell membrane and they're not getting the ions through. And so mucus starts to accumulate because the sodium ions in the water are having issues, and mucus accumulates on everywhere where you have respiratory, where you have mucous membrane passages, like your respiratory system, reproductive system, GI system. Excess mucus builds up and it causes problems. It is more common in Caucasian ethnicities for CF. Muscular dystrophy, that is a recessive trait. It is going to affect the muscles and eventually they will degenerate and it will become lethal. This is found on the, I want to say we have a picture of this later on, but this is a sex chromosome disorder. So it's going to be found on the X chromosome. We'll go through a whole bunch of other ones that are also found on the sex chromosomes. But muscular dystrophy is one of those that attacks the muscles and eventually they're not working like they should. Galactosemia and phenylketonuria are two disorders where your body isn't being able to process something. Galactosemia, you cannot break down galactose. You can't break that down and it accumulates in the blood and your blood's got all this sugar in it. Phenylketonuria is where you can't break down phenylalanine, the amino acid phenylalanine. And so that can also lead to developmental issues. We test for that now. Every baby gets tested for PKU because then you can adjust baby's diet to make sure the baby's not getting an overdose of these amino acids, these proteins that they can't break down. Sickle cell anemia. Most of us have heard about sickle cell anemia. It is prevalent instead of the Caucasian population, the African American population is more prone to sickle cell anemia. And what that is when we talked about our macromolecules and we talked about primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure. When you are building, our example for quaternary structure was hemoglobin. When you are building that hemoglobin molecule, switching out a single amino acid changes the shape and the structure of hemoglobin, and that changes the entire shape of the red blood cells, and they're not round anymore, they're sickle cell shaped, and that causes major issues when the red blood cells are going through the capillaries trying to get to these teeny tiny locations, and they can't because they get backed up because they're not the right shape. So that's sickle cell anemia. And then Tay-Sachs is a lethal disorder. Here's our Huntington's. Here's our other one. Tay-Sachs kicks in immediately, and with Tay-Sachs, it is going to be more prevalent in European, Caucasian, specifically European Jews, but it is a recessive lethal disorder, and unfortunately it causes blindness and seizures, and it's rare to make it to the age of 3 or even past 3 with Tay-Sachs disease. So a really sad, another sad lethal disorder. And these are recessive, so remember, they have to have 2 genes, both mom and dad have to pass on that recessive gene to their offspring for a recessive trait to show up and express itself. So when we talk about genotypes and phenotypes, we went over it before in the terminology, but we can see here, if we aren't quite sure what's going on with something, we could perform a test cross and C. But here we've got phenotype yellow. This phenotype is green. We're going to do a cross fertilization, and it's just like before where everything was purple. In this instance for the F1, everything is yellow. And then we'll breed the F1 with another F1. And what we end up in the F2, or the grandkid generation, is we're going to have a 75-25 or a 3-to-1 split where that green recessive trait comes back out. Phenotypes, what are the colors that you're seeing? Genotype, the actual genes. So here's the genotype for yellow. Well, we have 2 capital Y's. What are 2 capital Y's? Homozygous dominant. If we've got 2 lowercase y's, they are homozygous, but these are recessive. So homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, when we breed these 2 together and we made a Punnett square and we put, let's see if I can get this to work for us. I can. Awesome. All right, so we're going to say that the yellow Y's, the yellow P's are going to go over here. And then we are going to put the green P's over here. And you could put the green peas over here and you could put the yellow peas over here. It doesn't matter which way you set up your Punnett square. And now we're going to carry that information down. So I'm going to bring green peas, again, we're up here. So I'm going to bring each little Y down into its respective box. And then I'm going to carry over our dominant yellow peas. And we can see out of our box, everybody is heterozygous. Everybody is going to have one of these, and everybody's going to have one of these. So let's breed these guys together for the F2 generation. What happens with F2? So I'm going to bring over a little y, and then this one, and bring down a big Y, big Y, big Y is going to go across. Oh, I left out this guy, bringing him across. So when we bring these across, where I've got my little y and I put it here, and then I put it here, and then this guy got brought down here and here, what we end up with is this section. This guy is going to be recessive, green P. And then all these other ones are going to be yellow, because remember, the yellows only take one gene to show up. If you've got one dominant gene in there, you are going to, left that out, you are going to show up yellow in this case. So this is a 3 yellow to 1 if we're talking about phenotypes. If we want to talk about genotypes, our genotypes were over here, so I don't draw them out one more time, but we've got these, and these. We've got 3 different genotypes, 2 phenotypes. So we're going to do Punnett squares, so many Punnett squares. We're just going to keep doing Punnett squares. So let's keep going. Here again is that same exact example that I was telling you about with a Punnett square. If we are looking at a cross and we're just looking at one trait, one simple trait, what color are the peas? It is a mono hybrid cross. We're just going to P color. So is it yellow or is it green? And we're going to put them together. Everybody, again, in the F1 generation was a hybrid, was a heterozygous. If we bred those heterozygous together, here's one heterozygous, here's the other heterozygous for the F2 generation, then we end up with 3 different genotypes, 1, 2, 3, And then there's our genotypes. And here is our phenotypes, 3:1 phenotypic ratio. Genotypes are going to end up with 1 here, this one here, and then 2 heterozygous. So we have a 1:1 genotype ratio out of the 4 boxes. So hopefully that makes sense. On over your Punnett square, you're going to end up with 4 boxes. What do you have in those 4 boxes? Is it a genotype ratio of 1:1? Are they all the same? Are they all the exact same? Like this guy, if we were talking about this guy, it's genotype, there's no ratio. Everybody's the same. It's 100% heterozygous. But if we were looking at the F2 generation and we were asking for phenotype, 3 boxes are yellow and one of them is green. What I'm going to ask you for on the test, I'm going to ask for percentages instead of ratios. So I would say that this is 75% and this is 25%. How many boxes? 1 out of 4, 2 out of 4, 50%. 3 out of 4, 75%. All the boxes, 100%. That's how I'm going to ask you questions about Punnett square answers on the test. So more strict, dominant, recessive. So of course I had to pull in pictures of my own family because I always like to make it relevant. So you can see this picture of my family from 2 years ago. And so you can see everybody's hair color and what we all look like. And every time we go out and somebody sees my firstborn, handsome, adorable, lovely child, every time somebody sees his hair, somebody makes the comment, where'd that red hair come from? Where'd that red hair come? Where'd you get that? And so then I have to explain that it comes from both sides. So let's see how that red hair happened. So we're going to say that in this case, we're going to use B and it's going to be brown. And little b is going to be red. So in order for this to happen, you can see my hair color is dark, people. It's dark. It wasn't always that way. I used to be blonde. And you can see my husband's hair is also dark. So how did this happen? So on Punnett squares, again, you can put whatever you want wherever you want it. But I'm going to draw my Punnett square. And I put mom on the top every time I do my Punnett squares. You can put dad on the top, however you want to do it. So in order for me to have passed this on, I had to be a carrier of this recessive trait. So I never really thought about it because neither one of my parents are displaying this trait. Both of them, my dad has red hair in his beard that you would see grow out and up top, but you wouldn't really, he wasn't a full redhead. And my mom wasn't either. She was blonde, but she had red highlights kind of hidden in there, but it never really dawned on me about it. So clearly I got that. I had to have gotten that. So somehow I have this genotype. So I'm going to pull those down for me. And then my husband, he's got dark hair, but his father has red hair. So clearly that recessive gene's coming from his father. He could only give recessive genes. So my husband is definitely a carrier. And let's bring those across. Big B, big B, big B. So what do we have? What are the chances that our child would have darker hair? So let's look at phenotypes. We got dark hair for sure because we're homozygous dominant in this box. We are heterozygous in this box and we are heterozygous in this box. So if we're heterozygous, we still have one dominant gene in there, and it's going to mask the recessive trait. So 3 out of the 4 boxes, we have a 75% chance of having a child with darker hair. And we had a 25% shot of having a child with fairer hair, a recessive color hair. So that is how that happens, how recessive traits show up. If you have 2 parents that are heterozygous, that are carriers, just like in the purple flower heterozygous or the yellow and green pea heterozygous, when you breed 2 heterozygous parents together and their offspring, and you look at their offspring, in this case, it's a 25% shot of having a redheaded child with the gametes being able to produce from these parents. So 25% shot. I had no idea until they laid them on my belly and they were like, oh, look at that red hair. And I was like, what? There we go. That's how that happens. So there's no way that it's just on one side. It has to be on both sides because both mom and dad have to contribute a recessive gene for a recessive phenotype to display. So this is strict dominant recessive Punnett squares. We have albinism. Albinism is recessive. So let's see what happens if we did a Punnett square, and we'll just pretend. We're just going to make up stuff, and we'll say that somebody with the dominant trait would have darker skin color, and then somebody who has the recessive trait, the lightest color, I can get on here. Is this color right here. So albinism is a lack of pigmentation, and you will see it across ethnicities. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. If you've got this genetic trait, you got this genetic trait. So with albinism, in order for us to get a child that has albinism, it will be very similar to what we said here, that we'd have to at least have one parent who's a carrier and one other parent who's a carrier to have a 25% shot of a child that displays albinism. What if we said mom had albinism? How would we write that if mom had albinism? So let's doodle up our Punnett square. And if mom has albinism, how would we write that? Because if they've got albinism, remember it's a recessive trait. And if it's a recessive, what genes do they have? Is it one gene, both genes? How do we write it? Homozygous, heterozygous, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. How do we write that mom has albinism? I'm going to show you. So if she's got albinism, she is, again, displaying a recessive trait. So we would write mom's genes as this. She got nothing but this if she's displaying this trait. And I'm going to carry those down. And we will say that dad, what do we want to say for dad? What if we said dad was, let's say dad has homozygous dominant. He's not even a carrier. He's homozygous dominant for normal pigmentation skin. What is the likelihood that they will have a child that has albinism? If mom displays albinism and dad does not, if dad is homozygous dominant for normal pigmentation, is there a chance that their child will have albinism? Nope. Every box in here has a dominant letter in here. So there is a 0% chance of, I should erase that one. 0% chance of albinism and 100% chance of having darker pigmentation. What if dad wasn't homozygous dominant? What if dad was a carrier? What would we have then? If dad was a carrier, let's see if I can, oh no. If dad is a carrier, let's write this up again. So dad is going to have one normal gene and be a carrier for the recessive gene. Let's carry that information to their respective boxes. So I'm going to bring down mom's genes, bring across dad's genes. So dad has got a recessive gene here, and he's got a dominant gene over here. What's the likelihood of these two parents, if dad is a carrier and mom has albinism, what's the likelihood that they will have a child that has albinism? It is a 50% shot of having normal pigmentation and a 50% shot of albinism where you are lacking pigmentation. What if we said mom was well, I think we've done both combos. We'll move on because we've covered most of this here for albinism and all the different combos that we could have. If we have two phenotypes and we don't know what the genotypes are, but we can see what the phenotype is, what you need to do, and this is a test question, by the way, if you don't know what you've got, what you need to do, what you need to perform is called a test cross. So on a test cross, we have two P's and they are phenotypes. And we remember that green is recessive. So green, we know that phenotype, we know that the genotype has to be homozygous recessive if we're going to display a recessive trait. It's got to be homozygous recessive to show up as green. So we've got two lowercase y's for the green piece. We've got a yellow P. So we know one of those is the dominant trait, but we don't know what the second gene is. Is that second gene also dominant, or is that second gene recessive? We don't know. So what you do is you perform a test cross, and you can see if you perform a test cross with these, with a recessive parent, so that recessive parent, recessive gene, recessive parent, recessive gene, we pulled those across and we performed a test cross. What do we get? If we assume that this gene is a dominant, then we'll put that here, and everybody coming out of here is going to be heterozygous. If we don't know what it is and we assume that it is recessive, when we combine that with an already recessive parent, then we get a 50-50 phenotype showing up in these boxes. So if you don't know what's going on, but you know that recessive has these genes and dominant has at least one of this gene to show up as this trait, then you can perform a test cross, and based on those offspring, now you know what genes you had in your parent plant. So if you don't know what it is, test cross. Another way that they analyze different genetics is a pedigree analysis. So it sounds just like what you would think with a pedigree for an animal. But we've got our first generation. We're tracking the genes for this condition, whatever this condition is. Maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's albinism. Sure, we'll say it's albinism. And everyone in blue has displays albinism, and everyone in orange does not. And then we can track and see what showed up from those parents. And so it goes down. It's not showing up here, but then it's here and it's here again and here. This is our pedigree analysis, and we can see first gen, second gen, third, and fourth, how it's displaying throughout the family tree. Okay, so everything we've talked about until this point was strict dominant recessive. It is discontinuous variation, like Mendel talked about, where it is one or the other. It is normal skin or albinism pigmentation. It is dark hair or red hair. It is yellow or green peas, purple or white flowers, one or the other. These are the exceptions to the rule. I'm going to want you to know examples for these exceptions. So this term is called incomplete dominance. With incomplete dominance, it's not one or the other. It's literally, remember in the beginning we talked about continuous variation, that you were some sort of blend between mom and dad? That's exactly what this is. Incomplete dominance is where you have red flower and you bred that red flower with a white flower, and together they created pink flower. A little bit of the genes are expressed from the white and a little bit of genes are expressed from the red, and so you get this kind of halfway blend of traits. That's incomplete dominance. It's not one or the other, it's in between. It's continuous variation. It is incomplete dominance, and pink flowers are my example for those. Another displaying is codominance. We've got different blood types, and the example for codominance are blood types. There are lots of different blood types out there. You could be A, you could be B. Let me change that back. You could be AB, and that's our codominant, or you could be totally recessive, which is O. If you are an A blood type, you are going to have antigens on the outside of your cell, these little things on the outside of the cell that say what type of cell you are. If you are A, you've got A antigens on the outside of your red blood cells. If you are B, you got B antigens on the outside of your red blood cells. And if you are AB, you have both. They are both displaying, and that is codominant. Both traits, it's not just one or the other or some halfway in between. They both display. You have A and B antigens. You are co-dominant. This guy is the example for co-dominant. We won't go into who can receive what kind of blood like we would for an anatomy and physiology class. From this takeaway, I really just want you to know that A is strict dominant recessive, B is strict dominant recessive, but if you have AB blood type, they're both displaying, and that is an example of co-dominance where you have AB blood type. If you have an O blood type, you are recessive. So we could do a Punnett square with blood types, and we can just do real quick one real fast Punnett square of blood types. And let's say mom has, I don't know, let's say she's got B blood. And let's say that mom is, if she's got B, we definitely have one B there, but mom doesn't have to have both Bs. Maybe mom has a recessive blood type, and that is O. So B is dominant over O, so mom would display B blood type, even though she's got the recessive O gene. She's still a B blood type. And let's say dad is going to be, say dad is A blood type, and we're going to make him homozygous dominant. So let's put in dad's genes, and then let's bring down mom's genes. And based on these parents and their blood type, what's the likelihood that you will get a child with O? Is there any chance that in those parents with those genes that any of their children are going to have O blood type? No, because O is recessive, and to get O, you need to have both parents donate an O, and you don't have that. So there is 0% chance that we will have O blood type. What about A blood type? Is there a chance that their offspring could have A blood type? Yep. So these guys right here, these are A's. Because remember, O is recessive, and you only need the one dominant trait. So these are A blood type. So we have a 50 shot. 2 boxes out of the 4 boxes, it's 50% shot for A blood type. What about B blood type? Any B's in there? Nope. So we have a 0% chance of B blood type. And then what about AB, our co-dominant blood type? It's the other AB. It's going to be this box right here. So you have a 50% chance with these parents that their offspring will either be AB, which is a co-dominant blood type, or A. That's what you're going to get with parents with this type of blood. And of course, we could go back in and tweak these parents' genes however we want to and get different results for this. But this is just one example of blood type Punnett square question. And you would be given the information. Dad is homozygous for A, and you know that A is a dominant blood type, so you know how to write that down. Mom is heterozygous for B, so one of those dominant blood types is B, and heterozygous means you've got a recessive, and we know that O is the recessive blood type, so we can write out how she looks on the Punnett square, and then we can figure out what the Punnett square offspring are and calculate our probabilities. I'm going to need you to do these on the test. So on test day, today, tomorrow, bring a piece of paper and show me the piece of paper in the camera so I know that you've got a blank piece of paper and you're not, I don't know, doing something you shouldn't be doing. Show me your blank piece of paper and your pen, and you can write down and doodle your Punnett squares while you're on camera trying to figure out these problems, because I mean, I got to write them down. I'm expecting you to write them down. So show me your blank piece of paper when we start up for this test, so you can doodle your Punnett squares since we have to do this online.